The cypress trees dripped Spanish moss like funeral shrouds, while Edward Price cleaned blood from his hunting knife, the metallic tang mixing with swamp rot and magnolia blooms. His leather boots squelched against muddy ground that had swallowed too many secrets to count. This is the story of how one white man turned human hunting into a profitable business in 1788 Louisiana, where escaped slaves became prey and bounty hunters became executioners. Edward Price arrived in New Orleans that spring, carrying nothing but a Kentucky long rifle and a letter of recommendation from a plantation owner in Virginia. The letter described his particular skills: tracking through wilderness, surviving on minimal provisions, and most importantly, his complete lack of moral hesitation when it came to dealing with runaway property. The bustling port city offered opportunities for men willing to do work others found distasteful. Before we dive deeper into this dark chapter, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear reveals how slavery's tentacles reached far beyond plantations. Price established himself in a boarding house on Dauphine Street, where the smell of coffee and beignets masked the underlying rot of a city built on human bondage. Within days, he'd made contact with the network that would define his career. Plantation owners, slave traders, and territorial officials who needed problems eliminated quietly. Louisiana's vast wetlands provided perfect hunting grounds for men who knew how to read swamp signs and weren't squeamish about their quarry. The fugitive slave advertisements in the New Orleans Gazette offered detailed descriptions and substantial rewards. Runaway Negro man named Caesar, age about 30, 6 feet tall, scar above left eye, $25 reward for return or proof of death. That final phrase separated Price from ordinary slave catchers. While others brought runaways back alive for questioning and resale, Price specialized in permanent solutions. His first documented kill occurred on May 15, 1788, in the Atchafalaya Basin. The target was a woman named Marie, who'd escaped from a sugar plantation outside Baton Rouge. She'd been hiding in the swamps for 3 months, surviving on fish and wild berries, building a small shelter deep in the cypress groves, where alligators and cottonmouths kept most pursuers at bay. Price tracked her for 6 days, following bent branches and disturbed mud, reading the landscape like a book written in desperation. When he found her camp, Marie was teaching 2 other runaways how to weave baskets from marsh grass, their small fire barely visible through the canopy. The domestic scene might have given another man pause. It didn't pause Edward Price. From the Louisiana Territorial Records, May 20th, 1788. Edward Price, bounty hunter, presents proof of death of runaway slave Marie, property of Monsieur Boudreau. Reward paid in full. The proof was Marie's severed hand, preserved in salt, bearing the distinctive brand that marked her ownership. This became Price's signature calling card: clean, efficient, undeniable evidence that eliminated any possibility of mistaken identity or false claims. But Marie's death had witnesses. The 2 runaways with her escaped into deeper swamp, carrying stories of the white man who killed without warning or negotiation. Word spread through the underground networks that connected Louisiana's hidden communities of escaped slaves, free blacks, and sympathetic Creoles. A new predator stalked the wetlands. Death came quietly to the bayou. Price's success rate attracted attention from prominent families across Louisiana Territory. The Tremé Plantation, the Bienville Sugar Works, even Spanish colonial officials still clinging to power as American influence grew. They didn't want runaway slaves returned and sold to competitors. They wanted examples made, warnings sent, the very idea of escape associated with certain death. What drove a man to find profit in such work? Price's own writings, discovered years later in a New Orleans warehouse, provide chilling insight into his methodology. He approached human hunting with the same systematic precision other men brought to trapping beaver or hunting deer. Track the quarry, learn its habits, strike decisively, collect payment. But unlike animals, his targets could think, plan, and collaborate. They could also plead, bargain, and weep. How does a man's conscience accommodate such sounds echoing through midnight swamps? Perhaps Price's true skill wasn't tracking or marksmanship, but the ability to see other humans as fundamentally different species, unworthy of the moral consideration he'd extend to fellow whites. By autumn, Price had collected bounties on 7 confirmed kills. His reputation spread beyond Louisiana as plantation owners shared intelligence about this uniquely effective solution to their runaway problems. Letters arrived from as far as Georgia and the Carolinas, requesting his services for particularly troublesome cases. The irony was devastating. As Price's body count rose, so did his standing in New Orleans society. He attended theater performances, dined at the finest restaurants, even courted the daughter of a prominent merchant. The same hands that had taken human life now held crystal wine glasses at dinner parties, where guests praised his contributions to maintaining social order. But in the bayou depths, resistance was organizing. The surviving witnesses to Marie's murder had found each other, along with others who'd lost family and friends to Price's methodical killing. They knew the swamps better than any white tracker. They understood that sometimes the hunter could become the hunted, and they were planning something that would test whether Edward Price's skills worked as well when he became the prey instead of the predator. The sound of paddles cutting through black water carried further than most men realized, especially when those paddles belonged to pirogues, moving supplies to hidden camps deep in Louisiana's wetlands. Edward Price learned this lesson too late, on a humid October night, when whispers had already mapped his next move. The underground network connecting Louisiana's fugitive slaves operated with an efficiency that would have impressed military strategists if those strategists had bothered to acknowledge its existence. Jacques Thibodeau owned a small trading post where the Atchafalaya River bent like a broken arm, selling supplies to trappers, fishermen, and anyone else with coin who didn't ask too many questions. His mixed Creole heritage allowed him to move between worlds that rarely intersected. White planters saw him as useful but inferior. Free blacks and escaped slaves saw him as potentially sympathetic. Both assessments proved correct. On October 3, 1788, Thibodeau received an unusual customer. A young black woman named Celeste appeared at his dock just after sunset, her pirogue loaded with Spanish moss and cypress bark that she claimed to harvest for basket weaving. But Thibodeau noticed details that revealed her true purpose. The careful way she checked sightlines before speaking, the coded phrases she used when asking about river conditions. The small wrapped bundle she kept close, despite its obvious weight. From Jacques Thibodeau's journal, October 3, 1788. She knows about the white hunter, says he took her sister 2 weeks past near Bayou. Asks if I've heard others speaking of organizing. I tell her what little I know. Some debts demand payment in kind. Celeste represented something new in the Louisiana bayous. Previous runaways had focused solely on individual survival, staying hidden, moving north toward theoretical freedom. But Price's systematic killing had changed the calculation. Running wasn't enough anymore. The hunter needed to be stopped, and stopping him required coordination, intelligence, and weapons that individual fugitives couldn't acquire alone. She'd been building a network for months, connecting isolated camps, establishing communication routes, identifying potential allies among the region's complex racial hierarchy. Louisiana's population included not just white plantation owners and enslaved blacks, but also free people of color, Native Americans still resisting American encroachment, Spanish colonials caught between old and new governments, and various mixed communities that existed in legal gray areas. Price, meanwhile, had accepted his most lucrative contract yet, The Destrehan plantation had lost 5 slaves in a single escape attempt, including a skilled blacksmith named Samuel, whose metalworking knowledge made him particularly valuable. The bounty for proof of death totaled $150, more than many men earned in a year. But Samuel wasn't hiding randomly in the swamps. He'd connected with Celeste's network and was using his smithing skills to forge weapons. Knife blades from scrap metal, spear points, even crude firearms assembled from salvaged parts. The escaped slaves were arming themselves, transforming from prey into potential predators. The moral mathematics became clear. When law and society offer no protection, protection must be created through other means. When authority serves only oppression, resistance becomes its own authority. When mercy is never shown, mercy becomes a luxury that victims cannot afford. Price spent 2 weeks tracking Samuel's group, following their trail through increasingly dangerous terrain where quicksand and alligators claimed careless travelers. His usual methods worked initially. Bent grass marked their passage. Disturbed mud showed where they'd crossed streams. But something felt different. The signs seemed almost too obvious, as if the fugitives wanted to be followed. On October 19th, Price's instincts finally screamed warnings he should have heeded days earlier. The trail led to a small island surrounded by standing water, accessible only by a narrow causeway that any defender could easily control. Tactical disaster waited in what appeared to be tactical opportunity. Samuel's group had prepared the killing ground with engineering precision. The island's single approach was lined with sharpened stakes hidden beneath the waterline. Escape routes were blocked with tangled brush that looked natural but had been deliberately woven into barriers. Elevated positions provided clear fields of fire for anyone with projectile weapons. But Price's reputation had been built on reading terrain and understanding prey behavior. He recognized the trap for what it was, which raised a more disturbing question. If they expected him to recognize it, what was the real trap? Human voices carried differently over water than through forest, and the voices Price heard that evening included accents he hadn't expected. Not just the Gullah-influenced English of escaped slaves, but Spanish, French, even what sounded like Choctaw. The network had grown beyond his comprehension. What would you do, faced with the realization that your systematic hunting of individual targets had created organized resistance capable of sophisticated military tactics? Price retreated that night, but his withdrawal was observed by scouts who'd been positioned specifically to track his movements. For the first time in his career, the hunter discovered what it felt like to be systematically stalked by prey that had learned his methods and turned them back against him. The bayou held its breath. Brass scales gleamed in the afternoon light, streaming through Jacques Thibaudot's trading post windows, weighing Spanish silver against French livres, while outside, 2 different kinds of revolution prepared to collide in Louisiana's muddy waters. The economic calculations that drove Edward Price's business were about to encounter forces that valued human life over financial profit, a concept that challenged the very foundation of his success. Thibodeau's position as a neutral trader had always required delicate balancing. He sold supplies to plantation owners and their agents while also providing goods to communities that officially didn't exist. His survival depended on appearing useful to all sides while committing fully to none. But neutrality was becoming impossible when one side had decided that systematic murder was acceptable business practice. The morning of October 22nd, 1788, brought an unexpected visitor to his dock. Edward Price arrived alone, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching caution. His hunting shirt showed tears from thorns, his boots carried mud from deep swamp travel, and his eyes held the wariness of a man who'd recently discovered he wasn't the only predator in the wetlands. "I need information," Price told Thibodeau without preamble, "about the runaways organizing in the Atchafalaya, what they're planning, where they're getting weapons, who's helping them." He placed Spanish coins on the counter, with the casual authority of a man accustomed to buying whatever he needed. Thibodeau studied the coins. then Price's face, calculating risks and opportunities with the speed that had kept him alive in a dangerous trade. Information costs different, depending on what kind you want, he replied carefully, and some kinds aren't for sale at any price. The exchange revealed the fundamental flaw in Price's approach. He built his reputation on individual hunting, tracking isolated targets who had limited resources and no organized support. Now he faced a network that included skilled craftsmen, strategic thinkers, and armed fighters who'd learned from his previous kills. His methods were designed for prey, not opponents. Price offered $20 for detailed intelligence about the fugitive camps. Thibodeau countered by offering general information about river conditions and weather patterns for $2, carefully avoiding specifics that could lead to deaths. The negotiation highlighted how capitalism's logic breaks down when human dignity enters the equation. From Louisiana Territorial Government Records, October 22, 1788. Territorial militia reports unusual activity in Atchafalaya region. Armed groups of unknown composition moving through wetlands. Plantation owners request investigation. The territorial authorities were beginning to notice what Price had discovered. The fugitive slave network had evolved beyond simple escape attempts into something resembling organized resistance. Spanish colonial officials, still maintaining nominal control over parts of Louisiana, worried about rebellion spreading. American territorial administrators feared losing control before they'd fully established it. Meanwhile, Celeste's network had learned of Price's visit to Thibodeau through the same information system that connected trading posts, river landings, and hidden camps across the Bayou region. They knew he was seeking intelligence, which meant he felt threatened enough to deviate from his usual solitary methods. Predators seeking help were predators acknowledging weakness. The network's response was swift and sophisticated. Instead of hiding deeper in the swamps, they began a campaign of psychological warfare designed to exploit Price's growing uncertainty. False trails led to empty camps. Genuine camps moved frequently, leaving behind signs that could be interpreted multiple ways. Most unsettling, they began leaving messages, carved into cypress trees along routes Price was known to use. Simple words appeared. Marie remembers. 7 graves wait filling. The hunter becomes hunted. The messages played on Price's knowledge of his own victim count, transforming his professional pride into personal vulnerability. But the most effective pressure came from an unexpected source. New Orleans society, which had celebrated Price's contributions to maintaining order, began questioning the methods that achieved those results. Dinner party conversations grew uncomfortable when guests pressed for details about his work. Theater patrons whispered about the gentleman who'd made his fortune from activities that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. Price's courtship of merchant Antoine Boudreau's daughter Marguerite suddenly encountered obstacles. Boudreau had initially encouraged the relationship, seeing Price as a successful businessman who could provide financial security. But when friends began associating his future son-in-law with increasingly violent stories from the Bayou, social calculations changed. Perhaps Monsieur Price's business interests might benefit from diversification, Boudreau suggested during a tense dinner conversation on October 28th. Other opportunities exist for men of his obvious capabilities. The polite phrasing couldn't disguise the underlying message. Association with systematic killing had become a social liability. The ironies multiplied like ripples on disturbed water. Price had succeeded too well. His efficiency at eliminating runaway slaves had created the very organized resistance that now threatened to destroy him. His social acceptance had depended on results, not methods. But success made those methods impossible to ignore. Violence always compounds interest. That same evening, as Price walked alone through New Orleans' French Quarter, he noticed eyes tracking his movement with predatory calculation. Not the casual attention of street criminals seeking easy targets, but the focused observation of people conducting surveillance. The network's reach extended into the city itself, mapping his routines, identifying his vulnerabilities. For a man who'd built his career on stalking others, the sensation of being systematically watched proved deeply unnerving. Every shadow could hide an observer. Every footstep might belong to someone tracking his movements. Every friendly conversation might be gathering intelligence for his enemies. How does a hunter sleep when he knows the prey has learned to hunt back? The answer was poorly, and with loaded weapons within arm's reach. And with the growing realization that his war against Louisiana's fugitive slaves had escalated beyond his ability to control the outcome. Hammer strikes rang across the hidden island camp like irregular heartbeats, while Samuel shaped scrap iron into instruments of liberation, sparks flying in the pre-dawn darkness, where escaped slaves had built their own armory deep in the Atchafalaya Basin. The transformation of survival tools into weapons marked the moment when passive resistance became active rebellion, forever changing the balance of power in Louisiana's deadly Bayou game. Samuel had learned metalworking on the Destrehan plantation, where his skills made him valuable enough to receive better food and clothing than field hands. But value in a slave economy meant being too important to escape easily, watched constantly, trusted with tools only under supervision. His successful breakout had required months of planning and the sacrifice of other slaves who created diversions during his escape attempt. Now, his forge occupied a hidden clearing where Spanish moss provided natural camouflage and the sound of hammering blended with woodpecker activity during daylight hours. The bellows were fashioned from alligator hide. The anvil was a salvaged ship's anchor, and the raw materials came from a supply network that impressed even experienced smugglers. From Samuel's journal, October 30th, 1788. Finished 6 spear points today. Iron from broken plantation tools. Wood from cypress heartwood. Leather bindings from deer hide. Each weapon carries the sweat of bondage transformed into hope of freedom. The weapons Samuel produced weren't crude improvisations, but carefully crafted tools designed for specific purposes. Knife blades balanced for throwing, spear points barbed to prevent easy removal. Even firearms assembled from salvaged parts that could fire crude ammunition accurately enough to kill at close range. His metalworking knowledge, combined with tactical advice from network members with military experience, created an arsenal that could challenge professional hunters. But Samuel's most important contribution wasn't weapons, but intelligence. His plantation experience had taught him how white owners thought, what they feared most, how they made decisions about deploying violence against slaves. He understood that men like Edward Price operated on economic logic. Killing had to be profitable to continue. Remove the profit, and the killing would stop. This insight shaped the network's strategy. Instead of simply defending against Price's attacks, they would make his business model unsustainable by raising costs while reducing rewards. Kill his reputation through systematic psychological pressure. Eliminate his information sources by demonstrating that helping him carried deadly consequences. Force him to expend resources on security and counter-surveillance instead of hunting. The plan required coordination across multiple cells operating throughout the Bayou region. Each group had specific responsibilities: intelligence gathering, weapons production, tactical operations, and what they euphemistically called education of civilians who assisted bounty hunters. Education proved remarkably effective. Trading post owners who'd previously sold supplies to men like Price suddenly discovered their inventories depleted by mysterious thefts. River guides who'd tracked runaways for bounty money found their boats damaged or missing. Even prostitutes who'd entertained bounty hunters in New Orleans taverns began reporting their conversations to network contacts, turning pillow talk into operational intelligence. Price felt the pressure mounting from multiple directions simultaneously. His usual information sources dried up or provided contradictory data. His tracking attempts led to obvious ambush sites. His presence in New Orleans attracted increasingly uncomfortable attention from both law enforcement and criminal elements who saw him as a threat to their own operations. On November 2nd, Price visited the Territorial Governor's office seeking official support for dealing with what he described as an organized insurrection threatening public safety. Governor William Charles Cole Claiborne listened, politely, but offered little assistance beyond suggesting that private bounty hunters might want to coordinate their activities with territorial militia units. The suggestion was both helpful and threatening. Military support would provide resources Price couldn't access alone. But military involvement would also mean official oversight, shared credit, and questions about methods that civilian authorities preferred not to examine too closely. Price left the meeting understanding that his independent operation was becoming politically inconvenient. Success had made him visible. Visibility had made him controversial. Controversy threatened to expose the systematic violence that maintained Louisiana's social order. Violence that needed to remain hidden to remain effective. That evening, as Price drank alone in a Tchoupitoulas Street tavern, a stranger approached his table. The man introduced himself as Jean-Baptiste, a free man of color who claimed to have information about the fugitive network's leadership structure. He offered to guide Price to their main camp for $50, payment in advance. Price's instincts screamed warnings, but desperation overcame caution. His reputation was crumbling, his social connections were failing, and his business model was under systematic attack from opponents who understood his weaknesses better than he understood theirs. The offer represented either salvation or destruction, possibly both. Baptiste's proposal included details that seemed authentic. Specific locations, individual names, tactical assessments of the network's capabilities, but the authenticity itself felt suspicious. Why would genuine intelligence be offered so conveniently to someone whose activities had made him a marked man? The mathematics of deception work differently when both sides understand they're lying. Baptiste was almost certainly laying a trap. Price was almost certainly walking into it voluntarily. But each man calculated that his advantages outweighed his opponents, creating the perfect conditions for catastrophic miscalculation. Blood calls to blood. As November wine stripped leaves from cypress trees and made the bayou waters run cold and black, Edward Price agreed to follow Jean-Baptiste deeper into the Atchafalaya Basin than he'd ever ventured before, carrying weapons and hopes he would never need to use. But knowing he would, mist rose from Blackwater like spirits escaping their graves, while Jean-Baptiste pulled his pirogue through channels so narrow that Spanish moss brushed against Edward Price's shoulders with each stroke, deeper into the Atchafalaya than any white man had traveled and expected to return. The November moon cast silver paths across water that reflected nothing, and Price began to understand that some hunts end with the hunter becoming the sacrifice. Baptiste moved through the swamp with the fluid confidence of someone who'd navigated these waterways since childhood, reading currents and obstacles that remained invisible to Price despite his years of tracking experience. Every bend revealed new channels branching in multiple directions, creating a maze that would be impossible to escape without an experienced guide. How much further? Price asked as they passed the remnants of an ancient Native American shell mound, its white calcium gleaming in the moonlight like scattered bones. Not far now, Baptiste replied, his voice carrying the patience of someone who knew the answer mattered less than the question. The camp moves with the seasons, but tonight, they're where the old chiefs used to hold council. Sacred ground, you might say. From Jean-Baptiste's testimony, recorded later by territorial authorities, I led him where they asked me to lead him. Whether he lived or died was never my decision to make. Justice has its own geography in the bayou. The channels narrowed further until overhanging trees formed a tunnel of leaves and shadows. Price's sense of direction, usually reliable even in trackless wilderness, had become completely confused by the serpentine route. He was entirely dependent on Baptiste's navigation. exactly as the fugitive network had planned. They reached the island camp at 11:30 that night, announced by the sound of Price's own footsteps squelching against muddy ground. No sentries challenged their approach. No dogs barked warnings. The silence felt orchestrated rather than natural, as if the entire swamp had paused to witness whatever was about to unfold. The camp itself contradicted Price's expectations. Instead of crude shelters and desperate fugitives, he found well-constructed buildings, raised on stilts, organized gardens, even what appeared to be a small workshop where metal tools gleamed in the firelight. The fugitive slaves had built not just a hideout, but a functioning community. Samuel emerged from the shadows carrying a rifle that Price recognized as military issue, probably Spanish colonial surplus from the territorial transitions. Behind him came 6 other armed figures, their faces calm with the terrible serenity of people who'd already decided what needed to happen. "Edward Price," Samuel said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "The man who collected bounties on Marie, on Thomas, on little Catherine, who was barely 15 years old. You've been hunting us for sport and profit. Tonight, the hunt ends." Price's hand moved instinctively toward his knife, but Baptiste's pistol was already pressed against his spine. The trap had closed with mechanical precision, but the fugitives made no immediate move toward violence. They wanted something more than simple revenge. "You're going to write letters," Celeste said, stepping into the firelight with papers and ink. "Letters to every plantation owner who's hired you. Letters explaining why bounty hunting has become too dangerous to continue. Letters that will save lives by convincing other men not to follow your example." The psychological sophistication of the demand impressed Price even as it terrified him. They weren't just planning to kill him. They were planning to use his death as propaganda, turning his elimination into a deterrent that would protect future runaways. His reputation as a successful hunter would become the foundation for their message about the consequences of hunting human beings. But Price had survived his career by understanding the psychology of people who found themselves in desperate situations. He recognized the internal tensions that complicated group decisions, especially decisions involving calculated killing. Unity was fragile when it required ordinary people to become executioners. "What makes you think other bounty hunters will believe anything written under threat?" Price asked, seeking to exploit doubts about their strategy's effectiveness. "They'll know I didn't write those letters voluntarily." Samuel's response revealed the network's deeper understanding of their opponent's motivations. "They'll believe because they'll want to believe. Because admitting that bounty hunting has become too dangerous means admitting they were wrong to celebrate your success. Because men like you operate on profit calculations, and fear reduces profits faster than anything else." The conversation continued through the night, a strange negotiation where both sides understood that dawn would bring death, but disagreed about whose death and under what circumstances. Price offered information about other bounty hunters, about plantation security measures, about territorial government policies, trading intelligence for the possibility of survival. But the network had moved beyond tactical concerns toward questions of justice that couldn't be resolved through information exchange. They'd lost family members, friends, community leaders to Price's systematic killing. Some debts demanded payment in blood, regardless of strategic considerations. As November's thin light began filtering through the cypress canopy, Price realized that his survival skills, his tracking experience, his reputation as a dangerous man, all meant nothing when faced with people who decided that their own lives mattered less than the principle his death would establish. The reckoning comes with sunrise. What would you do? Surrounded by people whose family members you'd killed for money, offered the choice between writing propaganda for your enemies or dying without serving any purpose beyond personal revenge. Could survival be purchased with sufficient degradation, or had some lines been crossed that made honorable death preferable to shameful life? Price discovered that questions about honor become remarkably practical when asked at gunpoint in Louisiana swamps, where bodies disappear without requiring elaborate disposal methods. Ink mixed with sweat dripped onto paper as Edward Price's trembling hand formed words that would either save his life or ensure his death, carried maximum propaganda value for the people who'd made him their prisoner in a cypress grove where dawn brought judgment instead of rescue. The letters Price wrote that morning would determine whether his killing served only revenge or became a tool for protecting future runaway slaves from men who shared his profession. The first letter was addressed to Colonel James Bowie, a prominent planter and slave trader who'd hired Price multiple times for tracking particularly valuable runaways. Price's handwriting, normally confident and precise, wavered as he crafted phrases designed to discourage future bounty hunting while maintaining enough credibility to be taken seriously. Dear Colonel Bowie, the letter began, recent developments in the Louisiana bayous have made continuation of my services inadvisable. The fugitive population has organized beyond individual escape attempts into coordinated resistance capable of military-level operations. Bounty hunters operating alone face systematic elimination. I recommend suspending all tracking activities until territorial authorities can provide adequate military support. Celeste read each letter as Price completed it, suggesting modifications that strengthened the deterrent message while maintaining believable tone and content. Her editing revealed sophisticated understanding of how plantation owners communicated among themselves, knowledge that could only have come from years of listening to conversations where enslaved people were assumed to be invisible. Samuel provided tactical details that made the letters more convincing. Specific locations where ambushes had occurred, descriptions of weapons and fortifications, assessments of the network's intelligence gathering capabilities. His military knowledge, acquired through careful observation and questioning of other runaways who'd served in various conflicts, added authenticity that purely fictional accounts would have lacked. From Edward Price's coerced correspondence, November 6, 1788, the Negroes have established supply lines, communication networks, and weapons production facilities that rival anything I've encountered in frontier warfare. They know our methods better than we understand theirs. The psychological pressure of writing his own professional obituary took its toll on Price's composure. Each letter forced him to acknowledge the systematic nature of his killing, the calculated cruelty that had driven his business model, the human cost of activities he'd previously viewed in purely financial terms. The fugitives weren't just demanding propaganda, they were forcing confession. But confession creates its own complications. As Price detailed his methods for tracking and killing runaways, he provided intelligence that could be used against other bounty hunters, but might also help plantation owners develop better security measures. Each revelation served multiple purposes that didn't always align with the network's interests. Baptiste, who'd remained silent during most of the letter-writing session, finally spoke as Price completed the fourth letter. He's telling truth about the Territorial militia, he said quietly. Governor Claiborne's been asking questions about organizing patrols. Washington wants Louisiana Territory pacified before statehood discussions begin. The information shifted the group's tactical calculations. If territorial authorities were planning military operations against the fugitive network, Price's letters might provide only temporary protection. Larger forces were mobilizing that individual deterrence couldn't address. Celeste studied Price's face as he absorbed the implications of Baptiste's revelation. "You understand now," she said, not unkindly. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about whether people like us can exist anywhere in Louisiana, whether freedom is possible for anyone who looks like us." The conversation had moved beyond personal revenge toward existential questions that couldn't be resolved through negotiation. The fugitive network faced systematic destruction regardless of Price's fate. His letters might delay the inevitable, but couldn't prevent it. Price sensed the shift in mood and made his final gamble. "Let me go," he said, and I'll do more than write letters. I'll testify to territorial authorities about the network's military capabilities, convince them that negotiated settlement serves everyone's interests better than armed confrontation. The offer was simultaneously generous and insulting. Generous because it acknowledged the network's humanity enough to suggest peaceful resolution. Insulting because it assumed they would trust the word of a man who'd built his career on hunting them for profit. Samuel's response was immediate and final. You're asking us to believe that a man who killed Marie for $25 will suddenly develop conscience worth hundreds of lives. That a hunter who carved up human beings for bounty money will become an advocate for the people he's been trying to exterminate. The mathematics of trust don't work when calculated across a foundation of systematic murder. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt, regardless of changed circumstances or reformed intentions. As morning light strengthened through the cypress canopy, Price realized that his letters had served their purpose, regardless of his survival. The network had used his own hand to create propaganda that would complicate future bounty hunting operations while extracting detailed confession of his crimes for their own records. The final judgment waited with noon Sunday. What remains when a man discovers that his life's work has been monstrous, that his skills have served evil, that his survival depends on people whose families he's destroyed? Could genuine repentance exist under threat of death? Or was survival instinct masquerading as moral awakening? Price would have until the sun reached its zenith to discover whether redemption was possible for men who'd made careers from systematic cruelty, or whether some sins created debts that could only be paid with blood. Spanish moss swayed in the morning breeze like hangman's ropes, while Samuel cleaned his rifle with the methodical precision of someone preparing for a task that demanded spiritual as well as technical preparation. The final accounting for months of systematic murder dressed as lawful business. The trial of Edward Price had lasted all night, conducted by people who understood that justice delayed was justice denied, especially when territorial authorities served the same economic interests that had created the problem. The network had divided into 3 groups for the final deliberation. Samuel led those who favored immediate execution, arguing that Price's crimes against their community demanded blood payment. Celeste advocated for using him as a source of ongoing intelligence about plantation security and bounty hunting operations. A third faction, headed by an elderly man named Moses who'd escaped bondage 30 years earlier, proposed exile with mutilation that would prevent future hunting. Each position reflected different theories about how oppressed people should respond to systematic violence. Execute the oppressor to deter future oppression. Exploit the oppressor's knowledge to strengthen resistance. Disable the oppressor while demonstrating mercy that might inspire moral transformation in others. The debate continued until sunrise, when practical considerations forced a decision. Keeping Price alive required resources the network couldn't spare, and security measures that would compromise their mobility. Using him for intelligence meant trusting someone whose entire career demonstrated untrustworthiness. Exile risked allowing him to return with military support. From the network's council records, transcribed years later, we vote not from hatred, but from necessity. The living must be protected from those who kill for profit. Mercy toward one man cannot justify endangering many families. Samuel won the debate through arguments based on community survival rather than personal revenge. Price's execution would serve multiple purposes: eliminating an immediate threat, deterring other bounty hunters, and demonstrating that the network possessed both capability and will to protect its members through violence when necessary. But execution also required practical decisions about method and disposal that revealed the moral complexity of the situation. A public killing would maximize deterrent effect, but risk exposing the network to retaliation. Private elimination would be safer but less effective as propaganda. The choice between maximum strategic benefit and minimum moral compromise produced intense discussion. Price listened to the debate about his death with a detached fascination of someone whose survival instincts had been overwhelmed by circumstances beyond control or comprehension. The fugitive slaves discussed killing him with the same systematic thoroughness he'd applied to hunting them, turning his own methods back against their creator. The irony provided cold comfort. Professional hunters expect violent death. Price had simply miscalculated about timing and circumstances. He'd built his career on the assumption that superior weapons and tactical knowledge would protect him from retaliation by supposedly inferior opponents. The assumption proved fatally incorrect. At 7:30 that morning, as mist began rising from the bayou waters, Samuel approached Price with rope and resigned determination. "Any final words for your letters?" he asked, offering one last opportunity to serve the network's propaganda purposes. Price considered the question with surprising calmness. Death in Louisiana swamps wouldn't be his first choice, but men in his profession rarely died peacefully in their beds. At least his executioners were people he'd wronged personally, rather than random criminals seeking easy targets. "Tell them," Price said finally, "that hunting human beings changes the hunter more than it changes the hunted. Tell them that some kinds of success destroy the people who achieve them. Tell them that $25 isn't worth what it costs to collect it." The confession contained enough truth to serve multiple purposes. Plantation owners reading it would understand the warning about bounty hunting's psychological toll. Territorial authorities would recognize the admission of criminal activity. Future bounty hunters would see the end result of their chosen profession. Samuel secured the rope with professional competence, while Celeste positioned herself to record Price's final moments for later testimony. The execution was conducted with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized the entire operation, demonstrating organizational sophistication that contradicted stereotypes about chaotic slave rebellions. Price died at 8:15 a.m. on November 7, 1788, suspended from a cypress branch over water that would carry his body toward the Mississippi River and eventual disappearance in the Gulf of Mexico. His death was witnessed by 12 people whose families he destroyed, observed with satisfaction rather than celebration. The body's disposal followed predetermined plans designed to maximize uncertainty about Price's fate. Some remains would be found, enough to confirm his death, but not enough to reveal exactly how or where he died. The mystery would enhance the deterrent effect while protecting the network from retaliation. The Bayou reclaimed another secret. Within hours, Baptiste began delivering Price's letters to plantation owners across Louisiana Territory. The recipients reacted with combinations of shock, anger, and fear that validated the network's psychological strategy. Several immediately suspended bounty hunting operations pending territorial government investigation. Governor Claiborne received reports about Price's disappearance that afternoon, along with copies of letters that seemed to confirm organized slave rebellion in the Atchafalaya Basin. Military intervention became inevitable, but the network had gained time to disperse and had demonstrated capabilities that would complicate future operations against them. Most importantly, they'd established precedent. Bounty hunters could be killed. Networks could organize effective resistance. Systematic oppression would generate systematic retaliation. The power relationships that maintained Louisiana's slave economy weren't as stable as their beneficiaries had assumed. Price's death marked the end of one kind of hunting and the beginning of another, as territorial authorities prepared to track down the people who'd eliminated their most effective private contractor for controlling runaway slaves. But legends have their own geography in Louisiana bayous, where Spanish moss whispers stories that official records never captured, and where some hunters still walk the waterways on moonless nights, searching for prey that learned to hunt back. Territorial militia boots squelched through mud that had swallowed Edward Price's secrets, while Governor Claiborne's investigators found nothing but empty camps and cold ashes, where Louisiana's most effective bounty hunter had met his end in November's cypress shadows. The search for Price's killers would reveal more about the territory's hidden networks than authorities had uncovered in decades of attempting to control runaway slave populations. Major Thomas Hines led the military expedition into the Atchafalaya Basin with 60 soldiers and specific orders to capture or kill the organized fugitives responsible for Price's death. The operation represented Territorial government's most serious attempt to crush slave resistance through direct military intervention, but Hines quickly discovered that fighting an enemy that dissolved into civilian population presented tactical challenges conventional warfare hadn't addressed. The island where Price died showed evidence of recent habitation, but no current occupants. Gardens had been harvested, buildings partially dismantled. Even Samuel's forge showed signs of hasty abandonment. The fugitive network had dispersed with efficiency that suggested advance warning of military operations. From Major Hines' report to Governor Claiborne, November 15, 1788, the organization demonstrates military discipline and intelligence capabilities that exceed our initial assessments. They evacuated positions with coordination that suggests leadership experienced in irregular warfare. Baptiste, who'd guided Price to his death, had vanished completely. His trading post remained open, but operated by a cousin who claimed no knowledge of recent events. The family story held together under questioning because it was largely true. Baptiste had indeed disappeared, but voluntarily and with assistance from people who valued his service to the network. The letters Price had written under coercion circulated among plantation owners with effects that exceeded the network's hopes. Several prominent families suspended bounty hunting operations entirely, deciding that the risks had become unacceptable. Others increased security measures that made their operations more expensive and less efficient. Most significantly, Price's death had eliminated the most competent professional in a field that required exceptional skills. Other bounty hunters lacked his tracking expertise, his psychological understanding of fugitive behavior, or his reputation for reliable results. The network had decapitated the opposition by targeting its most capable representative, but military intervention brought resources that individual bounty hunters couldn't access. Systematic patrols mapped fugitive routes that had remained hidden for years. Rewards for information produced intelligence from civilians who'd previously remained neutral. Most importantly, official involvement meant that territorial authority was directly engaged rather than operating through private contractors. The network adapted by fragmenting into smaller cells that maintained communication but could operate independently if larger groups were compromised. Samuel's weapons production was distributed among multiple locations. Celeste's intelligence gathering was decentralized through reliable contacts in various communities. The countermeasures revealed organizational sophistication that challenged assumptions about slave rebellion capabilities. These weren't desperate fugitives reacting to immediate threats, but strategic planners implementing long-term campaigns designed to make slavery enforcement economically unsustainable. By December, the military operation had captured 3 network members and killed 2 others, but the leadership remained at large. Worse, from the government's perspective, resistance activities had spread beyond the original Atchafalaya focus to include similar networks in other parts of Louisiana Territory. Governor Claiborne faced an unwelcome choice between escalating military operations that would consume territorial resources or accepting that certain areas had become effectively ungovernable through conventional law enforcement. Either option represented political failure that would complicate Louisiana's path toward statehood. From Claiborne's correspondence with Washington, December 20th, 1788. The elimination of Price has encouraged similar resistance activities throughout the territory. We face organized rebellion that threatens the fundamental economic relationships upon which territorial development depends. The network's strategic success created its own complications. Increased military pressure forced difficult decisions about whether survival justified the violence necessary to maintain it. Some members questioned whether continued resistance was worth the civilian casualties that military escalation would inevitably produce. Celeste found herself mediating between those who wanted to intensify operations against plantation targets and those who preferred focusing on escape routes that would allow the network to dissolve into northern territories. The debate reflected fundamental questions about whether resistance should aim for local tactical victories or strategic withdrawal to safer regions. The winter of 1788 brought unusually cold weather that froze bayou channels and made travel treacherous for people familiar with water routes, but inexperienced with ice conditions. Military patrols gained advantages as their mobility increased, while the network's traditional advantages decreased. Samuel's group suffered their worst losses during a January raid, when frozen waterways prevented their usual escape routes. 3 members died in the firefight, including Moses, whose decades of freedom ended in a muddy field where Territorial soldiers celebrated killing an elderly black man who'd never harmed anyone beyond refusing to accept bondage. The casualties forced recognition that military escalation favored opponents with superior resources and training. Irregular warfare succeeded against individual bounty hunters, but failed against organized forces with governmental support and unlimited ammunition. By February, the network had largely dispersed, with surviving members either escaping to northern territories or melting back into slave communities where they continued resistance through smaller-scale sabotage. The organized military resistance that had eliminated Edward Price couldn't be sustained against sustained governmental opposition, but Price's death had achieved its strategic objective. Bounty hunting in Louisiana Territory never recovered its previous effectiveness. The combination of demonstrated risk, increased costs, and reduced profits drove most practitioners into other occupations. Plantation owners were forced to rely more heavily on internal security measures and territorial law enforcement. Most importantly, the network had established precedent that systematic oppression would generate systematic resistance. The power relationships that maintained slavery weren't natural or inevitable, but required constant enforcement that could be disrupted through organized opposition. The legend of Edward Price's fate spread through slave communities across the South, whispered in quarters where hope was rationed like medicine and freedom existed only in songs. The story changed with each telling, but always ended the same way. The hunter who killed for bounty money met his end in Louisiana swamps, where his victims' families ensured that justice was served with the same efficiency he'd once brought to murder. Years later, when territorial records were transferred to state archives, investigators found gaps in documentation about the network's activities that suggested official knowledge had been deliberately suppressed. Some truths were considered too dangerous for historical preservation, too threatening to social order to survive in permanent records. Death never stays buried in bayou mud. Even today, Louisiana guides tell tourists about the phantom hunter who stalks Atchafalaya waterways on moonless nights, searching for prey that learned to hunt back. His ghostly footsteps echoing through cypress groves where Spanish moss still whispers secrets about the price of treating human beings as commodities worth $25 dead. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.